What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Litflix for online 11th grade language arts. This lesson is just going to be a fairly quick, honestly, overview of some of the American literary movements. Some we have covered already, some we are going to be getting a snapshot of through the end of the year. But it's important for you to understand kind of the walkthrough of the entire um, chronological order of these. All right, so the first one, and we started with this one at the beginning of this year, is Native American literature. Okay, about 1490, we kind of guess the 1700s. This was heavily based on oral tradition, so passing down stories. These includes fables, tales, myths, and even chants. Okay, they weren't written down originally, so there's a lot of different versions of them, but they all have kind of the same message. There's an emphasis on nature and the elements of nature and how things came to be. We talked about the origin myths, if you remember. So, why do grizzlies walk upright? And why did the earth float out of the sea? That was what the premise of Earth on Turtles' Backs were. So, if you remember those two from the beginning of the year. The next period was the early settlers period, so 1500s to 1670. We're still not talking about fiction. We're talking about letters they wrote, diaries they kept, journals, and just historical accounts of what was going on. All right, accuracy was often called into question. And the reason the accuracy was called into question, if you remember some of our discussions, even about rhetoric at the beginning of the school year, it's because Columbus wrote, for example, in his journal that we read from his point of view. And if you remember the readings, we talked about how he said that the people he met almost worshiped them and they were so amazed by their items that they brought. And so that's why people wonder how accurate it was. So anything related to letters, diaries, journals, that's going to be early settlers' time. All right, then we get into Puritanism. We actually did not read this piece this year. It was a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I might do it towards the end of the year if we have time. And so you would think, oh, the Crucible is Puritanism. It's covering Puritan themes, but it's actually something different. But Puritanism was all about the rules and what the Bible said, right? Because these were really early Christians. And so the idea of being afraid of God was their main focus. And so this is when you hear fire and brimstone, this is what they're talking about. So there's sermons involved in this, a lot of poetry, diaries, and then moral based stories, anything to really convince people to behave a certain way. All right. And so again, Anne Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, and Jonathan Edwards are some big uh, names that we know from this time period. And Jonathan Edwards wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I might use that towards the end of the semester. Then we get into the American Enlightenment period, aka Revolutionary Lit. All right. So all about classicalism or the age of reason. There's a lot of political and philosophical readings going on during this time period. Big names are Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, Phyllis Wheatley. A lot of your primary documents also came from this time period. Romanticism, excuse me, something we're going to actually focus on in the coming week. This is the idea that individualism was important, idealism, imagination, and finally really getting in, appreciating nature around them. A lot of times these works were set in distant times and places, so it wasn't always realistic. This is one of the biggest bodies of works during the literary movements. Names you might know: Emily Dickinson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and Herman Melville. And we're going to be looking at Emily Dickinson's Hope is a Thing with Feathers more closely. And if you want to know, she was so famous that there is a song out, right, or a poem, both, since songs are considered poetry, called Emily and Elvis. And so Emily Dickinson is a name that you'll know for a long time. Then there was a little bit of a sub period, dark romanticism and American Gothicism. All right. It overlapped with romanticism. This was centered around frontier wildness, anxiety, and lasting effects of Puritanism. So, sort of how the scary scare you into doing the right thing approach of Puritanism, how that left everybody. There's a lot of themes of horror, madness. Any of your older, scary or quote unquote tales would be involved in this. So your Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, things that you read in ninth grade. You read The Cask of Amontillado. You, I think, read The Raven in eighth or ninth grade, and then The Telltale Heart. I distinctly remember reading that in my eighth grade language arts class. So all of those are going to be involved in dark romanticism, along with the Scarlet Letter. Transcendentalism is a period that we're going to cover more closely coming up. So this also overlapped with Romanticism. And this was actually a comment of criticism to intellectualism and spirituality of the period. All right. Transcendentalists believed that men were good and nature was good. All right. There was a lot of emphasis on being one with nature. All right. They emphasized objectiveness of nature. Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson are names you might have heard of. We're going to look at Walden's Battle of the Ants a little closely, and we're also going to be looking at Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. Realism and regionalism, this is getting into more of those easier pieces, you could say. Easier in the fact that it was based around real life, tells stories of everyday people. But what makes these texts have more depth is the idea that the details are more important than the overall plot. All right, so Mark Twain is a name that you have heard of. We're not going to be reading any of his longer pieces, but we will be reading Roughing It, and then Kate Chopin. All right, a sub-movement of that is naturalism, goes along with the idea that real life issues, but this was specifically focused on social issues created by industrialization. So a book that you read, I think, in 10th grade would be Of Mice and Men. These types of books, as you saw in that, shows a darker but real side of life. Red Badge of Courage, Grapes of Wrath, these all show a man's struggle to adapt to the environment of, post-war and the effects that the Industrial Revolution left. John Steinbeck, Edith Wharton, Stephen Crane, and Richard Wright were all some authors that you may have heard of. Modernism, all right, now you're like, yeah, I get this, right? Authors typically really didn't pay attention to World War I and the Great Depression, World War II. They wrote reflective ideas of alienation, isolation, the idea of the individual and the human consciousness. And this is where symbolism was really thrown in. So we saw that a ton in The Great Gatsby. And so, especially in The Great Gatsby, for example, they talked about kind of like the idea that everybody was so over the war and over the plague that they, were focused on themselves. So obviously F. Scott Fitzgerald is the author we focused on, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, E.E. Cummings. Overlapped with that was the Harlem Renaissance, which we're going to be getting more into in these next couple weeks as well. All right, this was an explosion literally centered around Harlem, New York, and African American communities. The literature and the art reflected the African American experience specifically during this time period. One of the books I read in high school, and we won't have time to read it, but if you ever can, is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, sorry. Super intense book, but really great, and the truth about what was going on. And then we're going to be focused on Langston Hughes and some of his poetry. Postmodernism, all right, another overlap. This is just realistic views on reality. Arthur Miller, Kurt Vonnegut, J.D. Salinger. And then we also had some things like Sylvia Plath and Toni Morrison. The reason that The Crucible was involved in this is because it was based on, obviously, real effects of Puritanism. But like we talked about, it was also an allegory for the Red Scare and what was going on in America during that time. Contemporary literature, all right, this can seep into the present day. So this is about relationships between people. It's meant to make you feel emotional about things. Sherman Alexie, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Angie Thomas. Again, I also read The Color Purple in high school. Highly recommend it. read it again after high school, but it's a great book. And The Things They Carried is a book that you might have seen in our libraries, or even on your teacher shelves here. That's a great story, a composition of some short stories centered around the war and really the truth about it. It's a pretty intense book, also. All right, then we get into the category that you know, which is young adult literature. All right, there's a ton of different themes and topics covered in young adult literature, but it's specifically targeted at adolescents. All right, so that would be you. Mr. Stewart does a great job of helping you guys find books that you would enjoy reading. It's usually centered around your experience as a young adult. All right, we are going to be or I'm going to be offering you the chance to read a book by Jason Reynolds. You might have read Dear Martin, right? That was written by a Norcross student that Mr. Weeks taught. We have a ton of great young adult literature books in our library that you can check out. And then dystopian lit. This is another group that a lot of these get turned into movies. You can probably tell based on the slide, but it's focused on mass poverty, public suspicion, mistrust, oppression, the idea that these groups are living in an ideal society, but really it's not ideal because it's controlled by somebody else. And so the theme of man versus society is the strongest in this. You've probably at least seen one of the Hunger Games, one Divergent. You've heard about The Handmaid's Tale. If you haven't seen it, that's a really intense. It was turned into a show, but this is all like the idea that the anti-hero steps up and goes against the grain and against the